December 4th, 2024. This is episode 72 of the In a Nutshell podcast. I'm your host, Sean Vowells, and as usual, I'm joined by Joe Meade. Tonight, Joe and I will preview the Big Ten championship game taking place at Lucas Oil Stadium in Indianapolis, Indiana. Joe, it's not exactly the two teams that we thought would be here just last week, but it is the number one ranked undefeated Oregon Ducks and the number 3 ranked Penn State Nittany Lions. Now, of course, that spot would have been Ohio State's had they taken care of business against Michigan, which they did not. They'll still be in the college football playoff, and after we preview this game, Joe, we can go through how it's looking for the Big Ten in that regard. But, Joe, it's Oregon versus Penn State in Indianapolis. Not exactly the neutral sort of fan support that the Big Ten probably wanted by putting the game in Indianapolis, but one of these teams will clinch an automatic bid and a bye in the college football playoff.
Yeah, Sean, just real quick, I found this really interesting. The average ticket price to this game, not average, I'd say the lowest ticket price was like $20, anywhere 12 to 20, probably you could include fees, whatever. But last year when Michigan played Iowa, the cheapest ticket you could find is like $100. And that kind of speaks to the volume of the geographic disparity between Oregon and Penn State. Now, I'm not going to make a case that either team is not very popular. Penn State's going to probably have 70% of that stadium. I think perhaps even more, to be quite honest with you, just based on geography and the fact they haven't been to a conference title game in over 8 years. And then Oregon, I'm sure you're going to have a few people maybe local to the area or a few people traveling out there. But I don't think it's going to be much of anything, just in terms of crowd layout. I do think this.
The thing about it, Joe, is that
Yeah.
Penn State fans probably didn't think they were going to make it, to be honest. So maybe they are scrambling last minute to find something, and this is why these Ohio State fans selling their tickets. But it is a little bit. Oregon was the team that has been here for a couple weeks now. That's obviously pretty far away from Indiana, and with college football playoff potential travel, maybe fans are waiting to go to those.
Absolutely, Sean. And I do think, you factor in the Ohio State factor. This happened in 2021, to a certain extent in 22 and 23, but mainly in 21 and 24, where Ohio State was the odds-on favorite to represent from the East or represent in the second spot like this year. But unfortunately for them, all for naught. And that's why you may have a little more temperate of an environment. I don't think there's going to be many empty seats, just perhaps more people last minute, but I do still think it's going to be an intensive enough atmosphere where if it is a close game, it'll matter. But we're going to talk about the game itself when you're ready, Sean.
Yeah, in terms of, we'll start with the Oregon, Joe, because they are, I guess, the number 1 seed here. They'll be wearing their home uniforms. They are the Big Ten regular season champions. They come in at 12-0. Everybody remembers that great Ohio State game back in the beginning of October. But since then, Joe, they've only had one game, which was a one-score game, and we spent plenty of time talking about their close call up in Wisconsin. But, Joe, other than that, they've looked pretty good. They won handily at the Big House. They took care of Illinois. 10 of these 12 games, Oregon has looked like the best team in the country by a mile. So coming in, what do you think the outlook is for Oregon going into this game? Is it sort of just more of the same?
Yeah, Sean, believe it or not, I do think, despite the 1 versus 3 ranking, Oregon is a 3.5 point favorite. I think that's actually a little light. I think Oregon, in my opinion, is going to win this game by 2 scores. Just that was my initial thought. And as I've analyzed this matchup, I don't see many matchups where Penn State is going to have a severe advantage that they can really exploit. I think Oregon's dealt with elite playmakers, whether it was against Ohio State, whether it was even against Boise State at the beginning of the year. And I think Oregon's evolved a lot more since October 12th and definitely since September. I do think Penn State, outside of the Ohio State game, has played really good football in November, too. It's really hard to criticize their run of play this entire month, and it's really hard to go after Drew Aller or Tyler Warren for any matter. I do think in this game, they're going to have to really stay ahead and really not get behind the 8 ball, literally, because Dylan Gabriel's number 8. If Dylan Gabriel starts off, for example, if Oregon receives, they immediately go up 7-0. I feel Penn State's going to be compelled to score immediately. And getting into a shootout with Oregon is something that's going to be really challenging. I do think defensively they have the personnel to make Oregon's life really difficult, particularly with Abdul Carter. I think Tom Allen could blitz a lot, but as we've seen, Sean, Oregon hasn't faced Oregon hasn't faced just scrub defensive lines all year. They faced Michigan's defensive line, which, as we saw from Saturday, is very effective. They faced Ohio State's defensive edges. Say whatever you want about JT Tuimoloau, Jack Sawyer, Tyleik Williams. That's an effective pass rush. Oregon did great protecting Gabriel, getting the ball out fast, doing those little 8-yard out routes, and then catching them off guard with the run and softening them up. And I do think you're going to see a lot of that in this game.
And Joe, Penn State has had a couple closer calls than Oregon, but Penn State they have not lost away from their home field this year either. That Ohio State loss was at home. They had the close call at USC all the way back in October. They had the close call on the road at Minnesota, where a couple things go differently and they're not in this game. But potentially, if this one becomes a ball game late, Penn State can get to halftime within a score. Maybe they can lean on that experience to squeeze this one out. Because Oregon, now, Joe, this is the first time we're having a Big Ten championship game in the 12-team playoff. This will not be the last game for either one of these teams, which I don't think we've ever really said it in the Big Ten championship. I mean, Ohio State and Michigan did both make the playoff that one year. But that wasn't the Big Ten championship game. I mean, maybe you could say, well, it was the real Big Ten championship game, but do you think there'll be a little bit of holding a couple of your trick plays back or potentially not playing this game like it's your last because for these two teams it won't be, or is getting that bye really that important?
I do think getting that bye is really important, particularly for Penn State, because we're going to talk about this after we're done with the game preview itself. You're not guaranteed to necessarily have a home game, or even worse, even if you have a home game, you might be on the 7-8 line, meaning you're going to face either Oregon again, or you're going to face a really good Texas or Georgia team, likely at a neutral site that's going to be anything but neutral, because I bet you.
Yeah, one of those is the Cotton Bowl, which is at AT&T Stadium, and we can go through those on a separate episode. But yeah, we talk about pretend neutral games all the time in basketball, Joe. There might be a couple of those in the college football playoff.
Sean,
Did we lose you, Joe?
Sean, you cut out for a second. You said pretend neutral games, and then.
Oh yeah. All right, wait, I got you back. I just said we see a ton of pretend neutral games in basketball, and that there might be a few of those in the college football playoff, especially with Rose Bowl, Cotton Bowl, all that sort of thing. But yeah, you can go ahead.
No, Sean, absolutely. That's why I think Penn State is not going to be holding much back in this game, because I do think their path to the title. I think Penn State, regardless, is going to have a harder path to the title, because Oregon loses. It's hard to argue why they won't be the 5 seed.
Yeah.
Penn State, I could really see it anywhere from like a 6 to like even a 9 potentially, considering Ohio State's at 8 in that little format. Obviously, Ohio State's 6. But anyway, getting off that point, because we're going to talk about it later. James Franklin's his MO has been focused on the current game. I mean, if you really want a good laugh, and I'm not necessarily the biggest James Franklin fan in the world, but I was laughing by what off when a student there posted a TikTok. It was Penn State coming out of the tunnel, and it was very clear that Michigan had just beaten Ohio State. The student screams, "Hey, I'll see you guys in Indianapolis." And then Franklin narrows down the student. I thought this was one of the greatest things ever. Points at him, he goes, "Hey, focus on effing Maryland."
And they did. They did.
They did. No, absolutely. I mean, aside from the kickoff where they had a little nap on, I think they were extremely focused, maybe a little too focused after they ran up the score there. But regardless, Sean, I think James Franklin's going to be locked in on this. I'm not going to rule out any trick plays, maybe not necessarily a fake punt. I do think some Tyler Ward throws are in order. I do think maybe even a halfback pass. I think anything that James Franklin has in the bank, perhaps not emptying it, but I don't think he'll be afraid to transact a large amount out of it either, Sean. So Maybe that tempts Dan Lanning, but my money is on James Franklin going big in this game.
And that might be a little bit like he does that anyway, and most games. So I don't think he'll do any different in that department. I really hope this game is close because, say it's like a 3-score game in the third quarter. I think we could see some starters getting rest if the game is already over, and a conference championship game doesn't deserve that. But in the age of the 12-team playoff, we've got really just who's going to be the 1 seed here and who's going to be the 5 seed. I think Penn State will probably, well, if Penn State loses, they don't look great, then we can get into all that. But both these teams are going to be in the college football playoff, and just who will be getting that bye. Penn State, I don't think will drop out of the home game spots, but especially with a bunch of those teams, Joe, and I'll put the bracket up there for the viewers now, and this is the projection still, so this is not final, but a lot of those teams in the 5-12 range don't play again. Ohio State doesn't play, Tennessee doesn't play, Indiana doesn't play, Notre Dame doesn't play, Alabama doesn't play. So the committee's not really going to change their mind on who, like if a team doesn't play and they're below another team that doesn't play, that's not going to switch. So keep that in mind when you're watching all of these conference championship games. Joe, I'll ask you this. Who do you think this game means more to?
I think without a doubt it means more to Penn State and particularly James Franklin. I do think fans right now have calmed down a lot from about a month ago when they booed him during the Penn State alma mater following that 20-13 defeat at home to Ohio State. I think a large part has to do with the fact they're in Indianapolis, and a large part has to do with they're not the biggest disappointment in the conference like they were around a month ago. I mean, that's clearly on the foot of Ohio State. I will say, though, a loss here and a loss in the playoff without a significant win, like a significant home win or a significant quarterfinal win, then what can you really say is different from Penn State? If they don't make the Final Four here and they don't have a conference title, is the narrative any different? I would argue it's not. I'm not trying to say that they're a bad program. I think a lot of programs would be really happy to be in Penn State's position, but it's more of the same for the James Franklin detractors, and unfortunately for him, that's been a large portion of this fan base over the last 3 years.
And Joe, I think we mentioned this pretty early on after it was announced that the 12-team playoff was coming into play, is that Penn State, if they sort of had the same regular season that they've had the last couple of years, that was probably going to be good enough to get in. And that means beating everybody else that's not named Michigan or Ohio State. They don't have Michigan this year. They don't beat Ohio State. Well, they beat everybody else, and here they are. So I do think, to quiet the noise, I think they probably do need to win a game in the playoff. And, if you're hosting a game against an SEC team in the middle of Pennsylvania in December 21st, I think it's way more likely that they win at home in the cold than in a dome in a neutral. But I'll ask you this, Joe. Do you believe Penn State is really the third best team in the country? A lot of people don't.
No, Sean, I absolutely don't. I think they're probably the third best team in the conference. And even then, some Indiana fans might be in our messages arguing.
We might see that game in the first round, Joe, if Oregon takes care of business here.
Yeah, absolutely. No, Sean, I don't think Penn State's the third best team. And I'm not going to discredit them either. Their schedule's their schedule. Penn State did not make the conference's schedule at all. And believe me, Ohio State didn't play anyone that good in the non-conference. And I don't think Oregon scheduled Boise State knowing they were going to be the juggernaut they've been so far for the group of 5. So, no, Sean, not a top 3 team in my mind. And if you want further proof, I think it's the way they've showed up in their biggest game of the year against Ohio State. I can't unsee that. Unfortunately for them, that's been their one real test, and they failed it, while Oregon's had 3 tests and passed all of them. Maybe not with all flying colors, but they passed it regardless.
And Penn State did play a road game against a power conference opponent in the non-con. They took care of business against West Virginia. Now, they had their coach fired, so it's not all that impressive at the end of the day. But, I think Penn State's probably around the 5th or 6th best team. And, if Oregon wins here, that's about where they'll be seated. So, I do think probably Notre Dame is playing better football than them right now. I think we both agree Ohio State played them and beat them only by a touchdown, but Ohio State still went on the road and made a couple mistakes and still won the game. But yeah, I think 5 or 6 is pretty appropriate for Penn State, and I do think Oregon will win this game, Joe, probably by 7-10, where they're in control the whole way. They just surely can't, you know, punch that ticket a little early. They might let them hang around for too long. Maybe a costly turnover will get them over the edge. But Joe, in terms of Oregon, before we get your prediction, they've definitely been the best team in the country so far. A little bit of a slow start, that game at Wisconsin that we talked about, but every other game has been a significant victory. And if the field stays the same here, Joe, and they're able to win this Big Ten championship game, they're going to have 3 wins over other playoff teams. And that's very impressive, assuming that would be Boise State, Ohio State, and now Penn State. But Oregon has to be the favorites in this game, and I think the team with the best odds to win the national championship.
Absolutely, Sean. I think aside from Texas, Oregon's been the most impressive team, and the elephant in the room is Texas made a made a big mistake on October the 19th when they played Georgia. That was not a great performance at all at home, and probably one of the biggest games in Longhorn recent history. Oregon, and their biggest game in Duck recent history, won the game. Now you could meme on Will Howard, talk about the OPI all you want. They won the game, so. We're not really here to judge refereeing at the end of the day. We're here to judge results in Oregon. Their results have been the best in the country, hence the #1 ranking. And Sean, I think this would just cap it off here and really solidify the idea.
Yeah, so Joe, let's get your prediction, and then we can talk about a little playoff scenario here.
Sean, I'm gonna give Oregon winning this game by a score of 37-21. I don't necessarily think it's gonna be a blowout. I do think they might get a few points here at the end, but I do think they're going to keep Penn State at a steady distance. If I'm Penn State, the biggest thing I would do is try to not let Oregon do those little 8-yard out routes. I would try to force them to run and see what Jordan James is made of. I think he's a heck of a back, but it's something Oregon hasn't really had to do yet. Not to say they won't be successful, but we've seen it already where they do the dink and dunk and then they throw long. I don't think Penn State's secondary I think Penn State's secondary is actually a little better than Ohio State's, but I do think that formula is not one for success for Penn State if they're going to let Dylan Gabriel get comfortable early and then continue to get comfortable. So I think getting to him is the biggest key, and then forcing them to run and not getting beat by big plays. And then Penn State's offense, this has been the biggest critique of Franklin over the years. They need to show up in the big game. This is one more opportunity before the playoff.
Yep, I've got 38-27 Oregon, Joe. Similar storyline where I do think Penn State probably won't drop as much as they will if they get thoroughly dismantled here. But Joe, all right, we have got a bracket back up on the screen for the viewers. Obviously, that #1 seed is currently occupied by Oregon, Penn State at the 5, Ohio State at the 8, and Indiana at the 10. Joe, is it simple as Oregon drops to the 5 with a loss, and Penn State, obviously the margin definitely matters here, but I would think that they at least drop below Notre Dame with a loss. Do they drop below the SEC runner-up too? And then Ohio State comes into play. Ohio State won the head-to-head. They both have 2 losses. With the scenario that you had in mind here, sort of not a convincing Oregon win, but a solid win where they were winning the whole game, where do you think that slides Penn State into at the end of the day?
Sean, in this scenario, we could talk about the other if you really want, because it's just moving a few things around. If Texas, who is favored, I know they lost to Georgia at home earlier. If Texas, who is favored, if chalk holds there, so long as Texas does not lose, I do believe Penn State would be slotted in as the 6.
So above Georgia, below Notre Dame?
Above Georgia, below Notre Dame. And this is what's going to cause a lot of fireworks, probably above Ohio State, which is going to make people really angry. And to be very clear, I think they have every right to be angry because the head-to-head, especially winning, I'm gonna call it semi-convincingly because Ohio State fumbled at the 1 yard line. They really could have won that game 35-13 if they had everything if they controlled everything the right way, not even gotten lucky bounces. I think the committee's gonna make the and this is impossible to predict. We have no precedence for this, Sean. But based on what I saw the 14 playoff committee do, it's hard to punish teams. It's hard to punish teams playing in conference title games, especially if it's a close game. I think the biggest example of this was TCU in 2022 and Georgia in 2021. Last year was unprecedented with the amount of undefeated teams and whatnot, and the fact that Texas had beaten Alabama. I think that whole conundrum made for the perfect storm. So, yes, I do think Penn State would drop to the 6. Oregon would definitely drop to the 5 if they lost, even if um, because if Texas loses, that's 2 losses. Oregon's 1, and Oregon does have a more impressive win than Texas does. So, Oregon would be the 5, and then probably Texas 6. I would think Texas would be the 6 above Notre Dame simply because the Northern Illinois loss is a bigger blemish than losing twice to what would be the 2 seed. And then Notre Dame would be 7. I really wonder if Ohio State should worry about anything. I think they're pretty solidified in the 8, perhaps the 7 if a lot of chaos happens. And then you get into the whole issue of SMU Boise. But I will say, I think it's pretty clear that the farthest Penn State could fall as 8, and I don't think they're in danger of not hosting a playoff game unless this is like historically ugly. I'm talking 2014 Ohio State Wisconsin 59-0 ugly, which I don't think it'll get.
Yeah, and it will be it will we both think Oregon's going to win, so that Ohio State Penn State argument is going to come up. I'm sure we'll talk about it after they make this decision, but it's going to be hard for Ohio State fans to take it, honestly, because they beat Penn State on the road. They also played Oregon to 1 point on the road versus a loss on a neutral. Obviously, we're projecting a lot of things here, but potentially that is an argument we could have after we get the field, Joe, in just a couple of days. And Indiana likely is headed towards an away game, with them not playing. The only team that I could really see dropping below them is Georgia if they do get sort of humiliated by Texas. But the ACC is essentially a play-in game. If SMU loses, then that bumps Alabama off the bottom. The Big 12 champion will likely be slotted right into that 12 seed. And after that, Joe, it's just a lot of things that can happen. Are they going to judge teams if they lose badly? We heard a couple things today saying that SMU should withdraw from the ACC championship game so they can't get judged with a negative loss. Now, that's a little bit ridiculous, but a lot of things are still on the table. We have never seen this 12-team playoff before, like you said, and your guy, maybe not your guy, but Michigan's AD Ward Manuel is at the helm here. And to be honest, Joe, he did pick a good year to do it, because I think Michigan's going to be involved in almost the rest of the 12-team playoffs here. And if your team is in it, you have to, leave the room so that your other people's opinions on your team don't negatively affect your opinions on them. So he'll be the one answering the questions on ESPN after the 12-team field is released. But, Joe, until then, we've just got a bunch of championship games to go over here. A couple teams don't play, others do, and we'll be sure to recap this one and maybe a couple of the other ones here on the channel. So thank you, everybody, for tuning in to this Big Ten Championship game preview. We'll see you next time.